So thank you very much for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the next part of our discussion, What Has History Taught Us? Please allow me to introduce our guests. We have Christopher Davis, Professional Research Fellow, Oxford Institute of Population Aging. Damian Krnjevic, Professor of Practice, ADA University. Juan Gabriel Tocatlian, Director of Department of Political Science, Universidad Torquato di Teia, and Peter Hahner, Historian, Director of Rubicon Historical Institute. My first question is, of course, related to the title of our discussion. What does history tell us of how wars end and peace is achieved, and what makes peace last? Peter, you are the historian.
Thank you very much. Is it working? Yes. I have a very short answer to all of this, nothing. I don't think that history can teach us anything. I don't think that governments, nations or private persons teach anything. Or the other answer is that the situation is the same with the school. In the school we teach, we learn what we want to learn, what we want to remember, what is in our interest. So I think the story of human history is such a long movement, such a complex movement that everybody can find what is in his or her interest. So everybody learns what is in their interest. And about the peace, I think those peace are more successful when the losers are not humiliated too strongly. Let me remind you for the Congress of Vienna in 1814, 1815, when the loser, France, was not humiliated too much, too strongly, and some years later he was invited again into the smaller group of the great powers.
Christopher, maybe?
Yes, well, I'm an economist, but I've studied particularly history of the 20th century as it relates to Russia, Eastern Europe, and also wars. So I wouldn't try to summarize all of world's experience, but what I think we could do is say that you can define certain categories of how wars end that encompasses them. So one is total victory for one side, as happened in World War II with the Western alliance with the USSR against Germany and Japan. Another way is if the sides exhaust themselves and you end up with an armistice of the sort that exists in Korea between the North and the South that has a certain amount of legality agreements between the sides. Third would be just a ceasefire where both sides somewhat agree to stop fighting without really developing much at all. And that could be in the category of the frozen conflicts that exist in the USSR, like in Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, or Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia, etc. There may be other categories, but I would say then peace depends on how the war ended in this category. And the best way for it to end is, the fourth category would be that there's a cessation of the hostilities and a formal agreement between both sides. That's probably a good ending because then there's a certain predictability of how things are going to develop in the future, and that means both sides can reconstruct and develop and aid can come in and so on. Whereas just to have an armistice or a frozen conflict creates a lot of difficulties for the peace to follow. So that's all I would say about history. You know, history can provide a lot of examples for these categories.
Damian and Juan?
Thank you. I want to sort of build on what Christopher was saying. So yeah, sure, obviously some version of a frozen conflict that involves an armistice. But there are some other examples sort of that are useful. Obviously the intra-Korean one, but the other one that occurred to me that could be understood as being a part of not necessarily a model, but certainly something that could be part of the calculus. Israel-Syria, right? Israel-Syria has been, without having resolved the underlying issue, these two countries haven't been shooting at each other with, give or take, a couple of random flare-ups, but for decades. And that in and of, and nobody has made the argument, or at least nobody serious has made the argument in the intervening period that somehow this is a suboptimal outcome. Everybody understands that there is going to be one day, maybe in theory, something more permanent, something signed, this and that. There were some initiatives that ended up not working after the Yom Kippur War and all that, but basically this is one of the most stable borders in the Middle East, notwithstanding the fact that it has not been formally resolved. And everybody's learned to live with that. Yep. And I think that there's a certain degree of creativity and the establishment of various aspects of a modus vivendi that has allowed all of the sides to maintain their various positions and at the same time not sort of, caused a ruckus in the conduct of international relations, in regional power relationships, and even in overcoming some of the other conflicts in the context of the Abraham Accords and elsewhere. So that might not be a bad way of thinking about one of the possible alternatives. All right, and then there are some other ones. I remember reading Edward Ludwak, who I think was here recently, who has this whole interesting idea about plebiscites, and he goes back to sort of post-World War I, and the fact that this was able to be arranged in logistical circumstances that are obviously that were much more primitive then than they are now. And I don't want to get into that because I'm not sure that I agree with it, but certainly, some plebiscitary aspect as part of finding a solution that, again, may or may not be formal, but it could be useful. But I think the most important thing is that, so what I've said and what Chris said, all of us, more or less, are tilting in the direction of understanding that sooner or later some kind of a compromise needs to happen, right? And the alternative is the perpetuation of maximalist claims, by the Russians, by the Ukrainians, by those who support Ukraine. And this inevitably brings up the nuclear question, right? So there's a public report now that has come out that has talked about the U.S. intelligence assessment about when Russia would use a nuclear device. And that's not the same thing as engage in nuclear war, because the Russian doctrine and well, not the American one, but the Russian doctrine certainly makes a distinction between tactical devices and all-out, hardcore nuclear war. And the American intelligence assessments basically has three topics, or three instances in which this could happen. If Putin's presidency was at stake, if Russia's military enterprise in Ukraine were to be in imminent collapse, and 3, if Russia was facing the loss of Crimea. Right? So forget about whether or not this is in accordance with international law or whatever, but simply this is the American intelligence assessment of when the Russians might consider pushing the red button. And if the point is, let's continue to encourage the perpetuation of this war, then we get into what even the American intelligence assessments are saying is not impossible, namely the opting by the Russians to push the red button. And it seems to me that this is one of those genuinely important lessons. You can go back to Cuba, which presumably somebody will bring up, and so on, that a compromise is necessary when a nuclear power is involved. Is that fair? Is it unfair? Is it just? Is it right? Doesn't really matter.
Could I just bring up one example to supplement his that is based in Europe? That is in North versus South Cyprus. You remember Turkey invaded Cyprus to gain control of an enclave with Turkish-speaking population. Was that 1974? I forget. But that's a frozen conflict. That still exists. And that's with Turkey and NATO, Greece and NATO, Cyprus in the EU. It shows how difficult it is to resolve some of these disputes, but also reinforcing the point you're making, it's very stable. You know, they aren't doing things constantly. So history can teach us some things, I think.
All right, Juan, well, what makes peace last?
Well, first, thank you very much for the organizers. I believe I'm the only Latin American at this event, so I will try to bring some of our perspective.
Your flair.
I don't know if it's flair, I will say the perspective. I'm not an expert in history, I am an international relations scholar, and taking Latin America into consideration, I want to raise the question of how to avoid wars, something that is different from war or peace as the main issue that was brought to our attention. And this is very important because Latin America has experienced the least number of wars of all the regions in the world for the last 200 years. And I think that that experience can at least help to understand, not to judge or to justify, but to understand the current situation and the potential eventual contribution of Latin America to this question, the war in Ukraine. Three main instruments were essential for Latin America to avoid war. First, regional dialogue. Second, third-party mediation. And third, international arbitration. Those were successful means to resolve, to avoid the possibility of war. And I think that that gives Latin America in general the right to a voice in this conflict. And that right to a voice was expressed by President Lula of Brazil, who brought to the attention both of Joe Biden, Xi Jinping, Lavrov, European leaders, the initiative, not the proposal, the initiative of peace. And what he wanted to concentrate is to give this message. War itself is the problem. And so if war is the problem, then we have to face, apart from the origin of it and the evolution of it, how to avoid a devastating consequence of this war. That makes me also make a short reference to something that was said yesterday. One of the commentators said that the global south was very ambivalent. That was the term used yesterday in terms of this war. From a Latin American perspective, there was no way of accepting this. Latin America was not ambivalent. What Latin America did was, at the level of the Security Council, Mexico and Brazil were there, and then at the level of the General Assembly, whenever the issue of territorial integrity and sovereignty came, Latin America, in a vast majority, voted with the West. Now, that doesn't mean that Latin America adopted the language of the fight between democracy and autocracy. Latin America didn't accept any pressure from the United States to provide arms shipment to Ukraine, and Latin America didn't even support any system of sanctions, because we know by experience that sanctions do not work. Cuba is the greatest experience. 60 years of continuous sanction against Cuba, and nothing had changed. Absolutely nothing had changed. And on the other hand, let all us recall the fact that the number of countries that are providing either arms or are part of a sanction system are only the 26% of the whole membership of the UN. So this is a very small community. It's not the world. It's one part, small part of the world.
My next question is, I think we have all spoken about, you have all spoken about different points of view about this conflict, so it's important to ask, why does the rest of the world not really accept the Western argument of what's at stake in this war? Damian.
Well, I think part of it was just touched on, right? You have the situation, but let's see if we can dig a little deeper into this. China is the only permanent member of the Security Council that has been entirely consistent with regards to taking seriously, with no exceptions, the defense of the two basic tenets of the UN Charter upon which everything else stands, namely the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its member states. It's the only one, right? And you can argue that all right, so people earlier have talked about how the Russians have violated these two core principles, not just in the context of Ukraine, but in other conflicts, including the one, the land grab in Georgia in 2008. But that was in August. In February 2008, these two principles were fundamentally violated in my country. I happened to be the advisor to the foreign minister of Serbia at the time, where a secessionist entity unilaterally declared independence and was immediately supported by the majority of the Western world, understood as, let's say, member states of the European Union and NATO, and then fellow travelers. All right? The Russians, at least in a declaratory sense, said that the Kosovo precedent is the one that they're invoking in the context of Georgia. And then so on and so forth, and later in the context of Ukraine. It matters, obviously, whether this is true or not, but it also matters whether the perception is one that can be embraced by the rest of the world. And this speaks to the point, I think, that a vast majority of the, let's say, non-Western world, Parag Khanna has this great term, the second world, right? Or the developing world, or whatever else you want to call it, has simply failed to be convinced by the Western argument that this is somehow an existential threat to what is called by its proponents the rules-based liberal international order. And the reason, or one of the reasons why there is a genuine failure to be convinced, I think, is because the rest of the world really does see that this is not simply something that the Russians have done and no one else ever has. And that, in turn, speaks or gives credence to the charge of hypocrisy. And again, it doesn't really matter whether, if you think it through in a super serious, scholarly, academic way, the analogy holds or not. I mean, it does, obviously, for those of us who take seriously scholarship, but most politicians, tend not to do that. But the perception is, at least there's a prima facie argument to be made, that this is not something that is somehow new and unique, and therefore something that needs to be not just condemned, but fought against in some sort of existential sense.
Crusade way.
Peter, if you have something to say.
I completely agree.
Well?
Well, let's start from the basic. The basic is that we live in an asymmetrical world. Asymmetry, disparity of power, whatever you want to call it, is the reality. In that sense, I think that the West in general, and for that I include obviously Europe and the United States, doesn't understand that asymmetry creates different interests and different priorities. And the question is how to manage the discord between Western interests and priorities and non-Western interests and priorities. In that sense, for Latin America at least, we are living two continuous tragedy. Pre-COVID, with very low growth in most of the region, COVID, plus now a war that is European but has global consequences. So there is a lot of frustration in Latin America, and that explains a lot about the positions of the different countries. Second, the idea that here you have only one responsible, I think is a mistake. There is a major original responsible for this war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's for sure. But after that, we have a lot of irresponsibilities. And those irresponsibilities are part of the West through its way of handling a proxy war in Ukraine. The third question, which is basically what you just mentioned, is that the idea that that the rule-based order is the maximum way of understanding and handling international relations. From the South, this is a myth. I mean, we witness forceful regime change. We witness coercive diplomacy. In many instances, the West is a source of disorder, not of order. Look at the Middle East. Why was China so successful in dealing with Iran and Saudi Arabia? I believe it was because the West was too accustomed to administer chaos. That was the only thing that the West has done in the Middle East. And last but not least, we search for autonomy. We want autonomy. We want our autonomy to be respected. And so, in a way, these are the elements that somehow were put forward not only by Latin America, but I will argue most of the global South.
Well, I'll just pick up a few points, and the two previous speakers have mentioned that there is in the approach to the war, there is a grouping supporting the rules-based international order, liberal democracy, and so on. Of course, there are other ideologies in the world, so it's fully possible that more people are living under governments that are communists with Marxism-Leninism than was the case in 1990 with the end of the Cold War, depending on how population growth in China stacks up to the loss of countries that we're talking about. But there's also a strong nationalist development. You know, a lot of countries, such as India, do, in their case, have Hindu nationalism. Under Erdogan, Turkey has become quite nationalistic. These ideologies are quite different from liberal democracy and particularly the attempt of the West to impose one single model on the world. But what's also happened is that the objective economic situation has changed globally with the rise of India and China as very important powers. And now, just to follow up the point Juan was making about who's supporting, who's not, according to a calculation I made, the percentage of global GDP supported by the liberal democracies imposing sanctions on Russia makes up 41% of that global GDP, whereas the share of those not supporting, excluding very small countries, is 46%. So, in other words, there's been a real shift in the power balances, and it gives more confidence, I think, to the global South in making up their own mind and looking after their interests. And finally, I'd just say there is a historical memory. Again, previous speakers have referred to it. In my paper I've finished about the economics of the war in Ukraine, I thought it was appropriate to put in a table about all the wars that are ongoing in Africa or in the Middle East or have been finished that have more casualties than those in Ukraine, but have been completely ignored by the West. So I think there is a feeling in Africa and other countries that the West is privileging Europe, and in particular white Europeans, over populations suffering at least as much, but without any of the great support that's being provided to Ukraine. So there's a bit talking about asymmetries, but there's a symmetry in the response to a conflict when there are probably 10 conflicts going on right now that are severe. Okay.
Damian, I think you wanted to add something?
Thank you. I just want to make 2 points about this. And I agree, but I think it's important to bring out the counter-argument just for the purposes of making sure that we cover it. You know, the proponents of this hypothesis that somehow the whole world is on board with this Western-led sanctions and export restrictions regime. This is on, right? Yeah. Is that it's one of the arguments that are brought up are the UN General Assembly votes, right? Mm. Some overwhelming number of member states vote in favor of this, and then there are some abstentions and very few that vote against it. Well, let me just 2 things about this. These are entirely symbolic and completely meaningless votes, as are most things in most votes of this sort in the General Assembly. They have no teeth. They're declaratory, and if you're getting pressured by various great powers to get on board, it's a lot easier to raise your hand in New York than to impose sanctions. Yeah. And that's why it's genuinely important to look at the numbers on the one hand of those who voted in favor of these various condemnatory resolutions, plus some of the abstentions, and then compare that number to the number of countries that have actually imposed sanctions, and it's 3 to 1. Just another, to illustrate the point of how useless some of these UN General Assembly resolutions have been, every year for the last 20 or 30 years, I forgot now when it started, the UN General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly to condemn the American blockade of Cuba. And the numbers are even higher than the numbers that condemn Russia for the invasion and all that business. And obviously it hasn't affected one by even, a millimeter, the conduct of American policy towards Cuba. And you can look at resolutions with regards to the Syrian civil war and so on and so forth. There are a million of them that simply are sort of a multilateral demonstration of nothing, except for the rhetorical value and then the power the persuasive power somehow in the public space that gives to those who take these things seriously, but nobody actually takes this seriously. And that comes into it's incredibly important to understand this concept of false universalism, right? Where the landscape in public discourse is such that it sounds as if everybody's on board. And that's clearly not the case. And the reason has nothing to do, in most cases, with people or with countries and leaders standing on the side of Russia or standing on the side of Ukraine or the West or China, whatever. No. But they simply don't see that this is something that requires their active involvement and support of one side or the other. Because the narrative that is present, certainly in Western public discourse, is not one that is universally embraceable. And the problem is that in many Western countries, including most of Hungary's neighbors, the perception that in fact is the case is that it's not the case. I phrased it improperly, but you understand what I mean. I think that there's an understanding in many Western capitals that the whole world is with us. And that's simply wrong. It's not just that it's wrong, it's that it's dangerous. Because it then allows leaders and publics to somehow think that they're in the midst of something that is at the vanguard of a global crusade is the wrong word, but a global endeavor to do good and avoid evil. And that's simply not the case.
So what are the war aims of each side, and who benefits from this conflict, really? I think, Damiana, we'd like to hear you first, and then maybe the others.
This is on now, yes? Yes. Look, it's a very long question, or long answer, and I would give one element of it. I think this is the third time in the 21st century that China, through no action of its own, has been the beneficiary of Western hubris. The first time was in 2003, Iraq, when the focus of the United States and some of its allies really shifted to the Middle East. The Chinese just did their own thing and nobody paid attention. Serious strategic policy attention. Second time was in 2008, when the global economic chaos that resulted from actions that took place in various Western stock markets, starting in New York, where this required a bailout for the first time in history from a non-Western power, namely China, and that's what the G20 was about. The G20 was basically the construction of a new institution that basically said the only criteria is not that you're a Western country, that you're a democracy, that you're whatever, but that you have cash in your pocket and that you're willing to spend it. And the Chinese were happy to do that because they thought that this would somehow get them into a situation that would be advantageous to them from the way that they understand their national interests, and the Saudis and others, and so on. So that's point number two, the sort of second instance. And the third instance is this one. Through no fault of their own, through having done very little, or basically nothing, to encourage this kind of a situation, China is in a situation in which it can basically make Russia its Belarus for free. Now, what I don't understand is how this is in the interest of the West. I genuinely don't understand this. And if the longer this war goes on, the more likely it is that that scenario can play itself out. And if the West thinks that China's the big enemy of the 21st century, then that's tantamount to geopolitical malpractice.
Well,
let me put the answer to your comment in a broader context, and maybe this is part of being an academic, and that's a problem. Let me assure you that. My sense is that we are witnessing two different twilights that reinforce each other. The first is the end of a very short cycle known as the post-Cold War. In essence, the post-Cold War was supposed to bring, allegedly, a new order led by the United States, meaning by that a global convergence in terms of economics and politics worldwide, but this faced a lot of crises and a lot of contestations. An international law crisis, Kosovo, 1999. An international financial crisis, 2008 in the United States, and then Europe. And two contestations. First, 9/11, the contestation by a non-state actor, a brutal contestation. Second contestation, the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014. In a sense, the invasion of Ukraine is the final curtain to this very short, extremely short cycle. It's over. The post-Cold War is over. The promises, the understandings, the way of imposing a narrative, it's over, like it or not. Then there is a second downturn, that is a downturn of a long-term pattern evolving since the 18th century up to date, and that is the pattern of Western order centered basically in the rules, ideas, institutions, values, and interests of the West. The locus of power is moving in another direction, more to the east than still in the West. This is a gradual downturn, but is a downturn because now we have other actors with rules, with interests, with values, with institutions, with ideas that are not Western. We are living a post-Western order, like it or not. And the question here, the main question here, is that a lot of things that are happening, coming from the East also, somehow reflect the fact that many countries, some of them former empires, have a lot of grievances with the West. So this is a post-Western world that will be more plural, obviously, but more contentious also.
Just to go back to a historical example, Juan, do you think that, so the question is, did Washington and Moscow learn anything from placing the world on the brink of destruction back in 1962 in Cuba?
Well, there were several critical landmarks during the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, the Vietnam War, many others. But the most dramatic and potentially catastrophic one was the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. I think that three elements were crucial there to understand the final solution to that stalemate that was going to cause potentially a world catastrophe, mainly in our continent, not in your continent, in our continent. First, diplomacy over the military. General Curtis LeMay proposed in one of the audiences within the Kennedy administration, let's go and nuke Cuba. Let's go ahead. They have to stop him. Diplomacy was crucial. Second, there was an individual, Adlai Stevenson, the US ambassador to the UN, that was portrayed as an appeaser, as someone who was willing to concede to the Soviet Union, because in the end, the formula by which the United States took the nuclear missiles that were in Turkey and the Soviet Union withdrew its nuclear missiles from Cuba was his formula. But it was finally accepted because there was a critical mass of policymakers close to Kennedy that said that is the best option to avoid a nuclear war. Which are the differences? Now, I do not see diplomacy working at all. I see no Adlai Stevenson there. And I do not see any quid pro quo. So my perception is that there are a lot of learning lessons that can be helpful today, but somehow, specifically in Washington, these lessons are not taken into account. One final comment. I do not know in the end, I am not someone who can preach or predict something, if there is an arrangement that will be between Russia and the United States or between China and the United States. In any event, I think that the world of Europe will be quite small.
Peter, which historical examples do you think we can learn from?
Well, I'm glad we are talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because that time none of the leaders of the great powers wanted a nuclear war. Khrushchev, what has Khrushchev said? Khrushchev hasn't said that I opened the war, I began the war. He said, I wish to put a hedgehog into the pants of Uncle Sam. That's all. So in that time, in 1862, everybody was afraid, everybody believed that it will be the end of the world, etc. But from our viewpoint, from this time, in the eyes of historians of nowadays, it doesn't seem so dangerous, really, because nobody really wanted to begin a nuclear war. And perhaps this can give us some hope, too, because I hope in this time it's the same situation. I hope nobody really wants to begin a war.
Yes.
Perhaps I'm too optimistic, I hope. I don't hope.
Christopher and Damian?
Well, I think many lessons were learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis and did influence decision-making both in the USSR and the West, NATO, for decades. But I think they've probably been forgotten by the newer generation people, and I won't be more specific about which side, but probably both sides. Two, and Juan has mentioned a number of lessons. There are two that I think I bring out that have been forgotten, and one is that you should be careful about moving military forces of your side into spheres of influence of the other side, because there are always risks, and that's whether it's intermediate range missiles going to Cuba or whether it's, in the more modern context, weapons going into border regions of Russia. Second, an issue that came up with the keynote lecture on Monday with George Beebe, I think he was probably asked this rather than brought it up, but he was asked about back channels, important back channels between the contesting powers, between, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the USSR, meetings in restaurants in Washington and so on. And the point he made is that there's very little evidence of back channel negotiation going on now about the war in Ukraine, because it's become such a toxic ideological event that almost all linkages have been broken down between Russia and the United States. And you mentioned Adlai Stevenson. Well, you can imagine what the United States press would do if some high-level official was secretly negotiating with Lavrov or someone else to try and sort out Ukraine. It's utterly inconceivable. So there are lessons that were learned that probably still are relevant, but are completely forgotten and non-operative.
Damian?
Yeah, let me make just a couple of... I just want to begin by reinforcing what Christopher said. The level of toxicity is unprecedented. Even at the height of the Cold War, whatever peak on whatever IR equation you can come up with, never has this level of toxicity been as high today, which is ridiculous given the fact that whatever the West thinks of Russia, I don't think that anybody is willing to say that it's even close to being understood as an existential threat objectively to the West, as opposed to what the Soviet Union was, which after all really was, the second pole in a bipolar world and posed an existential threat. Okay. Let me just make a couple of very short remarks with regards to the Cuban Missile Crisis and the lessons learned or unlearned. First of all, let's not forget that this whole thing started because of the Monroe Doctrine, right? Which is a classical sphere of influence argument. And certainly a case could be made for the fact that Russia is making a similar type of argument with regards to the Ukraine. That, of course, denies agency to Ukraine, but it also denies agency to Cuba. And so you can either, it would be useful if one could be consistent. Either you deny agency or you accept it, but in either case, that then should affect, the consistency of positions. But so Cuba aside, no, one more thing about Cuba. The fact that the United States was seen to prevail, right? There was this secret clause with the Pershings or whatever it was out of Turkey, but nobody really knew about that at the time. But the Americans clearly were seen to prevail in the outcome, the immediate outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis, namely the withdrawal of the Soviet nuclear missiles. And part of that had to do with the fact that Cuba was understood as being more important to the United States than it was to the Soviet Union. And I think you can make an analogy in the context of Ukraine, that Ukraine is never going to be as important to the West as it is to Russia. Again, forgetting about agency for a second, just in terms of this logical, this thought experiment, let's call it, right? And I think that would be true even if Ukraine was the only item on their respective strategic agendas of the West and of Russia. And clearly that's not the case. Certainly not in the Western context, given the understanding that China is the near peer competitor and the rest of it. But I think that there's something genuinely serious about this, the consequences of this kind of thinking. It would be useful to think through what this really means in terms of the Russian commitment to stay the course, unless a compromise can be reached. And I brought up, obviously, this US intelligence assessment with regards to the conditions under which the Russians might be inclined to use tactical nuclear weapons. This is something that Jeff Sachs spoke about yesterday, so I don't want to get into it again. But it's foolish to think that that's not something that is on the strategic table in the Kremlin.
Okay, then Peter, and after that maybe we'll still have time for one question.
On the second thought, perhaps I contradict myself, but if I'm thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the leaders of the great powers did not want to begin the war. But let's not forget that the Cubans, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara and others wanted to send the rockets to New York. Che Guevara told it many times till the end of his life that he wanted to send the nuclear rockets towards the United States. And this is dangerous. Perhaps when the great powers don't want to begin a war, perhaps their smaller allies, perhaps their vassals want it. And this is really dangerous.
Okay, and how have shifts in economic and military power balances, such as the rise of India and China, changed the international environment of the war? Christopher?
Well, since this is a history panel, I'd just like to mention a book that probably everyone's read, which is Kennedy's 1988 book about the rise and fall of the great powers. And he brought out, looking at experience over centuries, the importance of economic, military, and technological, the dynamics of economic, military, and technology in determining which power is going up, which ones are going down. I used that in a 1990 article related to the USSR, and I've been following the dynamics ever since. And I think what we can see now in 2023 is a changed set of balances in the world that's the result of what's been going on over the past 30 years with the rise, as you were saying, Laszlo, of India and China, but let's not forget Indonesia or Brazil or any number of other countries who have risen up. And this relates, it's not just to economic and military power, it's also technology. As part of our policy over the last several decades of globalization and deindustrialization and passing everything on to China and other countries, a lot of technology is developed there that used to be in the West. And this became very clear during the COVID pandemic, when China was a source of PPE and medical equipment, and it turned out India is the world center for vaccine production. So there are these major changes that have occurred, and they're reflecting or expressing themselves in the Ukraine conflict, getting back to what we were talking about before, in non-observance of sanctions, of continuing trade links with Russia, which then enables its economy to keep functioning and, despite all the sanctions, only lose 2% of GDP in 2022, whereas Ukraine lost 35% of its GDP in that year. So I think the global balances have been extremely important and will continue to do so because, as Juan was saying, we're moving into a new multipolar world that's being objectively determined. It's not just that somebody's come up with a new concept that they want to impose on the world. So,
Yes, Juan?
Well, let me introduce a question that is quite problematic from a Latin American's perspective. First, we suffered a lot with the Cold War. We were full of military governments supported by mainly Washington. Part of our development was somehow face a lot of difficulties in the context of the Cold War. And we lost generations of people due to human rights violations. So whenever, mainly in the West, basically more in the United States than in Europe, there is the sense of we are in Cold War II, we start trembling. We do not want a new Cold War. We are great losers in the Cold War. Second, the Cold War, in the end, and this is quite a very synthetic argument, was between two great major powers, but with different political, economic, and social systems. The level of rivalry was absolute, complete. Given those two things, and seen from Latin America, I will argue the following. First and foremost, the Global South, it's a player. And the Global South does not need a new Cold War. We do not want to import that from you. Second, the Global South has changed. By now, the sense in Latin America, I repeat, the sense in Latin America is that China is not anymore part of the Global South. By now we have two different Norths. The United States, it's the leader of one of the Norths that is geographically broader than the West. It includes, for example, Israel, it includes Japan, it includes South Korea as part of that global North. There is a second global North that is very diffuse yet, not cohesive yet, and this is led by China. So the question for us, for Latin America, is how to avoid acquiescence to both leaders of the two Norths, and how we preserve levels of autonomy vis-à-vis Washington, but also vis-à-vis Beijing. So in that environment, in that context, the problem of the war in Ukraine is somehow, for many Latin Americans, a trial, a test, a rehearsal of what will be the strong dispute between the United States and China.
So we have 2 minutes for a closing remark. Damian, maybe? And then the Q&A.
Thank you. Let me tell you what I fear. So I raised one fear in the sense if the longer this war lasts. I raised one of these earlier, that that Russia could become sort of China's Belarus. And the other one that I fear is that Ukraine can become the Bosnia of Eastern Europe. I'm half Bosnian, and also I've spent some time in government service in Serbia and so on. And I remember reading all of the files with regards to the breakup of Yugoslavia and the various peace processes that were cut short or couldn't come to fruition in time. And I just want to talk about Bosnia because it's really important. Not because of Bosnia per se, except for those of us who care about that part of the world, but as this kind of thing applies here. About a week before the hostilities really started, all of the stakeholders came together in Lisbon and agreed on a plan. It was supposed to prevent the war. And we don't know why, but what we do know is that one of the signatories to this then had a conversation with the American ambassador, and as a consequence of that conversation withdrew his signature from this document that had been agreed. That was in March 1992. And then we had war and 100,000 dead, half of the pre-war population of Bosnia displaced or made into refugees. Jihad came back to the shores of Europe. Between 50 and 200 billion euros of wartime damage. Nobody has done a genuinely serious objective assessment. The social fabric and the demographic picture irredeemably weakened. The present population of Bosnia is what it was in the early 60s, and it's getting worse. And so by every tangible and intangible way of measuring this thing, Bosnia remains worse off nearly 3 decades after the end of the war than it was before the war started. Despite untold billions of dollars that have been thrown at the problem without actually doing anything other than perpetuating something that really resembles a failing state. And I'm genuinely worried that the longer this war goes on, that's what Ukraine's going to look like. That's certainly not in Ukraine's interest. It's not in the West's interest. I don't know if it's in Russia's interest. But the moral argument for ending this war is or should be more important than the geopolitical war, than the geopolitical argument. And if that requires a compromise along the lines that we began to discuss at the beginning of this, then fine, so be it.
Okay, so thank you very much for this. I believe we have no time left for other questions. Thank you all for your remarks and comments, and please everybody stay for the next part of our event.